Hi folks, this is David Birchall and I'm doing the lecture pods for week 9 of When Worlds Collide 2020. And the topic for this week, as you'll be aware, is Gandhi and the emergence of Indian independence, covering a wide area. And so the first of these two lecture pods is going to focus on the context out of which Gandhi comes. And of course that's him on the right hand side of the screen then, and as Gandhi, sometimes known as the Mahatma. I'll come back to that later on. And the second lecture pod talks more about Gandhi himself, his life, his thought, his philosophy, and also the remarkable job he does of creating a sort of synthesis of an image of Indian culture and Western culture. In fact, I just might mention as a starting point here that though there's a big chronological gap between Raja Ram Mohan Roy, whom we looked at the other week, and Gandhi, whom we're looking at this week, there are also certain strange connections between them. They are both figures who become fathers, as it were, of the Indian nationalist movement, but they are also in some ways quite Western figures as well, and their ability to appeal both to Indians and to Westerners is partly a source of their power and symbolic power and influence. That's Gandhi on the right hand side of the screen there, as you can see, and on the subject I just mentioned. That's Gandhi in his personally designed, homemade, homespun clothes, standing outside number 10 Downing Street in London, the residence of the Prime Minister. And the wonderful paradox there, beloved of the British media of the time, is of course of this man dressed in a version of the garb of an Indian peasant, greeting the most powerful political figure in the United Kingdom. And the bottom right hand corner there, an even bigger stage on which Gandhi found himself, one of the few figures in the 20th century to be on the cover of Time magazine. And in those days, the most important news magazine in the world, not once but twice. First stopping off point in Indian history to mention, since leaving off a couple of weeks ago on this theme, is the fateful year 1857 in India. If you have relatives who are Indian or who have lived in India, you'll be aware that 1857 is one of those years where simply the date is meaningful in itself. Just as the dates of World War I and World War II immediately speak to us without people having to say what we're talking about. So you only need to say 1857 in India or to someone who knows Indian history and they immediately know what you mean. It was the first great revolt against British rule. It was a calamitous event, really. Many people died. There was a great deal of destruction, as you can see on the right hand side of the screen there. That's the aftermath of the revolt in different cities of India. That's destruction caused, apart from anything else, by British artillery shells. So there was a conjunction of factors which led to a revolt against British rule from within the Indian Army, which is to say from the Indian staffed British Army in India. And you can see some folks from that in the top right hand corner of the screen there. The most famous, notorious incident leading up to the rebellion was the famous cartridges incident. The British Army, for reasons known to itself, had created a new form of cartridge for its rifles, it would have been the Martini rifles at that time, I think, that were issued to Indian troops in the British Army in India. And the rumour had it, there was some basis to the rumour, that in the days before synthetic oils and lubricants, that the cartridges which were to go through the barrels of the British musket rifles of the time were greased with a mixture of pig fat and beef fat, which was interpreted in India, probably wrongly, to be an effort by the British to besmirch both Hinduism, where of course cows are sacred, and Islam, where of course there's a prohibition traditionally on the consumption of pork, as in Judaism. And so both Hindus and Muslims in the British Army were offended and connected this up with what they understood to be a pattern of disrespect. In the British Army in India, but also more broadly in British India, actions of disrespect that meant it was practically impossible for native Indians to become part of the officer class in the British Army, and therefore which left them really with the highest rank of sergeant or sergeant major, and therefore always forced to doff their cap to the British. The rebellion was the first crack in British authority over the time of the dominance of the East India Company. And its aftermath led to a great deal of soul searching back in England. The British tried to understand, why do they hate us? We think we've done such a fabulous job ruling the place, and yet they seem to hate us. How could this be? And in the British Houses of Parliament and in other places in Britain, the consensus emerged that this was not a new idea, but emerged more strongly after 1857, that the most important part of colonial rule was not to upset or distress the locals. Don't scare the horses, as the phrase often went. It was important not to cause offence, and in order to do that, you had to revise British rule so that you would avoid policies that might be offensive to one or more portions of the Indian population. And of course, we live in a world today where people are concerned about the giving of offence, and giving of offence on cultural grounds is still a big thing. But for the British in 19th century India, this effort not to cause offence ultimately created, well, it may have solved some problems, ultimately created problems as well. The British and the educated Indian elite, since the time of Ramohun Roy, had increasingly become concerned by social issues in India. The caste question. Was it right that there should be a caste called untouchables in Hindu India who should be effectively devoid of many basic human rights? Why were women treated as second-class citizens and confined to the home? Why were women coerced to marry when they were still children? And so on and so forth. These had been issues on which the British state and educated Indian intellectuals had been able to agree. So the efforts by the British not to cause offence on cultural grounds also put them in the back seat of many of the pressing social and political issues of the era in India. Lastly, last dot point there, the retreat by the British in the decades after 1857 from any sort of proactive social policies in India also led them to be incredibly vague, or to say nothing at all, about what people were expecting to be the Indianisation of British rule. The British started to go slow on introducing and promoting native Indian people in the Indian civil service and in other parts of British rule. And whereas the idea, of course, had been present from the time of Ramohun Roy, that at some point the British would leave, they became increasingly cagey and reluctant to talk about any such thing after 1857, and also started to treat, in an atmosphere of nervousness, any rebelliousness amongst the Indians as the precursor to another possible rebellion. And so normal human relations between the British and Indians became much more strained as a result. British officials in India, whenever they saw their servants chatting in the servants' quarters, worried. Were they plotting some kind of rebellion? And so many of the efforts by the British to deal with the rebellion, arguably with the benefit of hindsight, actually served only further to undermine British rule. An important context here for understanding also the rise of Indian nationalism and the nationalist movement in India is the extraordinary devastation wreaked upon Britain by the First World War. Now, you'll be aware, having done it at high school, the First World War was the great catastrophe of the early decades of the 20th century. It hit many countries very heavily, including Australia, of course. Every country town in Australia has its honour board of young men who died. Britain was especially hard hit, particularly since it was a country in Europe with a lot of prestige, but not a very great population. The population of Britain before World War I was somewhere between 30 and 40 million people. Doing that from memory, but I think that's right. And simply amongst combatants themselves, the young men who went off to fight in France, there were almost 1 million deaths. And that's in a cohort of young men basically in the first half of their 20s, including basically the entire educated middle-class young men of a certain age, more or less completely wiped out, many of them on the Somme, of course, in 1916. So World War I has a profound impact upon Britain as a country, but also upon the British Empire that had built up over the 19th century. World War I damaged Britain economically and made it a weaker country. It clearly became less capable of paying for the upkeep of its empire after World War I than it was before. The British Empire, World War I also stretched the British in their rule in their empire very thin. Britain was a small country which had contributed disproportionately towards the struggles on the Western Front in World War I, and that had dragged down the ability of the British to provide their own troops for the policing of their colonies overseas. And so increasingly Indians were policing and staffing the Indian army, and the British were far less capable of doing this by themselves. Now, in World War I, this has changed a little by World War II. World War I, most Indians, so far as could be told, were patriotic and supported the British cause, but also there was a rising tide of nationalism during the war, a sense that Indians, if they contributed to the war effort, which they did, should be recognised as such and should be treated as an independent force in relation to the British Army. And this also had consequences at the end of World War I for the aspirations of Indians more broadly, a sense that the British should recognise the contribution that Indians had made during the war. And the assumption starts to rise, for all the reasons I just mentioned, that Indian independence is now a matter of when, not if. Britain is seen as being increasingly incapable of paying for the upkeep of its empire, and increasingly starts to see the empire also as a financial liability rather than an asset. The East India Company had plundered India. The British, after World War I, start to see India actually as a financial liability. And to make things more complicated and more disastrous, as if World War I hadn't been disastrous enough, there's a horrific incident in a town called Amritsar in 1919, where a very foolish Colonel Dyer, I think it was, rather than General Dyer, ordered his troops to fire, including firing with machine guns, on an Indian crowd that had gathered to protest peacefully, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of the people in the crowd. And yet when he was tried back in Britain, he was kind of let off with a slap across the knuckles. And so the massacre in itself and the political fallout from the failure to prosecute Dyer successfully also started to lead to a sea change in British public opinion as well. Many liberal-minded Britons now found Britain's behaviour abroad in its empire an embarrassment, and public opinion in Britain itself started to turn against the empire by degrees in the years and decades after World War I. This was also the time of the emergence and rise of Indian nationalism in the form of the independence organisation known as the Indian National Congress, the ancestor of the Congress Party, one of the major parties of modern independent India. It was formed, as you can see there from the PowerPoint, in 1885 as a vehicle for Indian nationalism as it stood at that time. I don't have time to talk about this, except to say probably this is all we really need to know, that in the late 19th century, Indian nationalism is primarily a cultural and intellectual movement. It's an assertion of Indian pride in its history and its culture and its literature, and an assertion of the importance of India as a cultural force in the world. At that point, it's not primarily a political movement, though there were political aspects to it. But during World War I, as Britain's hold on India started to look more tenuous, and the British are struggling even to staff their forces in India, there's a transformation. The Indian National Congress starts to become a more intellectually self-confident organisation, and also to start to develop more aggressive and precise political goals. So in the period after World War I, the Indian National Congress starts to develop specific conceptions for how Indian self-rule might happen. There are terms, later picked up by Gandhi himself, that emerge into the lexicon of the Indian independence movement. One of them is Swaraj, or self-rule, concept that India in the ancestral past was one single unified country ruling itself, and that's where India should be at some point in the close future. And the second concept often seen as related to it, called Swadeshi, or self-sufficiency, which seemed to suggest that in order for India to attain self-rule, it would also need to become self-sufficient, possibly economically self-sufficient as well, though that often wasn't fleshed out very clearly. Nevertheless, despite the rising self-confidence of Indian nationalism in the period after the First World War, there were also profound tensions and problems within the nationalist movement. And if you know anything about modern Indian history, those tensions did not go away. There was a tension between two wings of the movement, between, if you like, the moderates, who wanted to conduct dialogue with the British, and the radicals, or sometimes known as the extremists, who wanted to rebel against the British by acts of violence and possibly even terrorism. There were divisions between the Hindu majority and the Muslim minority in India, and those divisions never disappeared, and in many respects became more important in the first half of the 20th century, and led eventually to the partition of India in 1947, the creation of India on the one hand, supposedly at that point a multi-ethnic, multi-religious nation, and Pakistan on the other, effectively a Muslim country. So there were deep Hindu and Muslim divisions, which the British sometimes played some part in stoking, though not a great deal of stoking was sometimes required. There was a divide and rule element to British policy in India to set Hindu leaders against Muslim leaders, but in fairness, they also did that quite well themselves. Lastly, and perhaps most obviously of all, despite the impressive looking clothes you can see on those folks on the right hand side of the screen there, which is actually in the time of Gandhi himself, in the early 20th century, the Indian nationalist leadership in the Indian National Congress are overwhelmingly highly educated, very often Brahmin Indians, many of them educated in Britain and very often more comfortable in a lounge suit than in traditional Indian garb. The task of reaching out from this very small elite culture into the vast mass of the illiterate Indian peasantry who didn't read newspapers or books and whose lives carried on much as they had done for centuries was a huge problem for the Indian nationalist movement, one which until the rise of Gandhi they had no answer. As I've mentioned already, after World War I, independence seemed more likely, but as I've mentioned just then, there were tensions. Top right-hand corner, you can see Jinnah, the leader in the 1920s and 1930s of the Muslim wing of the nationalist movement, the so-called Muslim League in India. As you can see, he is actually wearing a British-style double-breasted lounge suite and smoking a British cigarette, and probably has a glass of whiskey hiding somewhere out of sight. Given that he's a Muslim, he probably didn't want to show that. And there's Mahatma Gandhi talking to him there. So there were the tensions I just mentioned between religion, the question of caste. The nationalist elite was overwhelmingly high caste, but was trying to speak to low caste Indians, about whose lives they knew very little, really. Pardon me, yes, and also the gulf between the elite and the poor, which I just mentioned. The Congress movement itself was dominated on the whole by the Hindu nationalist leadership coming from Hindu India. This provoked a lot of suspicion amongst Muslim Indians of parts of the Congress leadership, and also, as I said, from the professional class. Most of these folks were modern, westernized Indians. Later on, there was a rumor that Nehru, India's first independent prime minister, used to send his shirts back to be pressed in laundries in London because he didn't trust the Indian laundries as being good enough at their job. It may or may not be true, that story, but it did point towards the gulf that often existed between the nationalist leadership and the wide masses of the Indian population. So last dot point there, to make the same point again, both for the Hindu and for the Muslim leaders of their respective communities, there was a vast gulf between them and the people they aspired to lead. The leaders were highly educated, often had been trained in the ancient British universities, quite commonly Oxford or Cambridge. They, not infrequently, were trained British lawyers and quite often Anglophile. They loved a cup of tea. You can see Gandhi down there having a nice cup of tea with Earl Mountbatten, the last British viceroy in India in the 1940s. They were often most highly fluent in English and knew little of the Indian vernacular languages which they required to speak to most other Indians. So the nationalist movement had a problem, and with the benefit of hindsight, it seems clear that Gandhi was the solution. So some words on Gandhi before moving to the second lecture pod. As I've mentioned already, he was on Time magazine's cover twice. Time magazine, in those days of paper magazines, was the world's most illustrious news magazine. It was full of political stories and also lots of cool photographs. I can still vaguely remember Time magazine from my childhood when my mum got a whole bunch of them from a garage sale going all the way back to the Vietnam War. Time magazine in Gandhi's lifetime was a quite influential political medium. As you can see there, he appears twice on the cover. The first, that's the big picture there, is interesting. He's presented there primarily as a spiritual figure, some kind of guru figure, alone with a natural background. On the right-hand side there, he is still a kind of Indian holy man, but now I think clearly a much more worldly figure, which may say something about the evolution of his identity in Western eyes. Okay, so some thoughts about Gandhi before wrapping up and moving to the second PowerPoint. He was, I think, is widely agreed, almost a unique figure, both in Indian political life at this time, but also across the world. He was, in his young adulthood, a British-trained and Anglophilic, to a large extent, Indian intellectual who recreated himself as a kind of spiritual figure for a kind of distinctively Indian spirituality, and also as a political leader of an entirely new kind. He pioneered, really, in the modern world, the systematic practice of non-violence, as, if you like, a kind of form of, if I can put it this way, political passive aggression, as a way of contesting your opponents by forcing them to be violent against you, rather than vice versa. It's very hard today, I think, second dot point there, to see Gandhi clearly as an historical figure. It's quite clear that if you read accounts of Gandhi at the time, he was, in a sense, everyone to all people. Anyone could see what they wanted to see in Gandhi, like him or not. Some British folks saw him as a fraud. Winston Churchill is notoriously supposed to have called him a seditious fakir, suggesting that he was a kind of phony spiritual leader who was really preaching political rebellion or subversion. Although actually, funnily enough, Gandhi and Churchill later on went on to have a quite friendly personal relationship, in fact. Other people treated him as a guru for India or even for the world. Many Westerners were enormously taken by Gandhi, seeing him as the kind of figure they wished their own countries produced. So the third dot point there, his personal vision had the capacity to appeal both to Indians and to Westerners. To Indians, he could seem like a figure of the people, leading the Indian people towards a new form of rebellion against the British, of non-violent rebellion. To Westerners, he could seem like the kind of spiritual figure that the modern West seems so conspicuously to lack, someone pointing back towards a simpler, purer time and rebelling against modern, soulless, industrialized materialism. So he was very popular with many people in the West as well, particularly in the intellectual classes. At his death, the eulogies were of all kinds. He was compared to Jesus, of course, the saviour of Christian doctrine, and Christian saints such as St. Francis of Assisi, with whom he himself was familiar. He was compared with literary figures like Tolstoy, which is understandable since Tolstoy was his hero, and so on and so forth. He was, as I said, in a sense, all things to all people, and simultaneously a hero figure in India and in the West.